Emily Hobson is a historian of radical social movements, queer politics, and HIV/AIDS in the United States, and associate professor and past chair of the Department of History and Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada in Reno. She received her PhD and master's degree from University of Southern California and her BA from Harvard and Radcliffe colleges. Emily received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities, 2526, which was, guess what, terminated by the federal government of the US. The National Humanities Center, which stood for 2425, the One Archives Foundation, Smith College, CUNY's Center for LGBTQ Studies at City University of New York, and the University of California at Santa Barbara, and many other sources. They are the author of Lavender and Red, Liberation and Solidarity in the Gay and Lesbian Left, which was published in 2016, and co-editor of Remaking Radicalism, a grassroots documentary reader of the United States, spanning 1973 to 2001, published in 2020. And Emily's current research examines the history of HIV activism, HIV/AIDS activism by, for, and with people incarcerated in the United States. And the title of today's talk, Women, Lesbian, Prison, Trans, Categories of Mobilization and ACT UP's campaign to change the definition of AIDS. So please join me in welcoming Emily Hobson.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all and folks who are online. Thanks for being here. I'm really so honored to be here, and I want to thank Aaron and the chair in Transgender Studies as an institution, and also Hill Malatino for the invitation to this series, and everyone who's worked to put it together. It really couldn't be a more important time to be working in trans history or in conversation with queer and gender and ethnic and indigenous studies, to think and fight together against crises mounting by the day, right? Of transphobia, of genocide, and white supremacy. So in that light, I really appreciate the scholarly and broader community that's reflected here, and I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you. So this talk is drawn from an article that is forthcoming in the journal Signs in winter of 2026, as well as from my ongoing book project about HIV and AIDS prison activism in the United States. And there we go. I thought that it might be useful in getting the 101 from Michael this morning. I thought it might be useful for you all to see some of the archives and collections that I've worked with in that project. You can see the pink highlights collections that really informed this talk and the broader article, and then everything else is kind of the book as a whole. I'll be talking today especially about the relationship between AIDS prison activism and women's AIDS activism in the 1980s and 90s. It's a topic I began to research some years back as part of this broader AIDS prison project. And I also began to analyze further in response to Signs' call for scholarship on the theme of lesbian studies now. Personally, intellectually, and politically, I've always found the category of lesbian to be intensely fraught by gender and sexual essentialism. And at the same time, I've necessarily had to engage with it in thinking about radical and anti-imperialist queer politics, right? So I've been really excited by the growth of scholarship that's taken apart and reimagined the relationship between lesbian and other iterations of gender and sexuality, and especially between lesbian and trans. And this scholarship has really offered me some critically important tools for thinking through the relationship between prison and women's AIDS activism. So that's the talk that I am presenting to you today. It's an effort to think through lesbian feminist responses to AIDS and incarceration and their relationship through the lens of trans critique. So the archives of the talk are kind of only glancingly about trans people, but the talk is centrally about trans ideas. And in that light, I hope it's helpful for all of your thinking about how to read material, both that is or that may not itself be trans, how to read that through the lens of trans analytic. Okay, So I will dive in. So in spring of 1989, members of the Women's Caucus of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, launched a campaign called Change the Definition. This campaign demanded that the United States Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, expand the diagnostic definition of AIDS by adding to its medical criteria several diseases and infections that were widely seen among people with HIV who were grouped as women, people of color, poor, or people who injected drugs. The conditions they sought to add were cervical cancer, pelvic inflammatory disease, chronic vaginal yeast infections, tuberculosis, bacterial pneumonia, and endocarditis. And after nearly 4 years of organizing, the campaign won victory. In fall of 1992, the CDC announced, and as of January 1993, it enacted an expanded definition of AIDS that recognized most of the conditions, specifically invasive cervical cancer, pulmonary tuberculosis, recurrent bacterial pneumonia, or a CD4 or T cell count under 200 as indications of AIDS. They also recognized chronic vaginal yeast infections as a symptom of HIV infection. The change brought many more people into diagnosis and treatment, as well as AIDS-related benefits and services. Overnight, with the calendar change of 92 to 93, observed cases of AIDS in people assigned female nearly doubled. And yet at the same time, because the metric of a CD4 count wasn't sex-specific, and two of the diseases added to the criteria, tuberculosis and bacterial pneumonia, are broadly linked to poverty and injection drug use, there are also cis men, trans women, and trans feminine people who are encompassed by the larger definition. Despite that breadth, Change the Definition had, from the start, been centrally framed through gender, taking as a guiding slogan, "Women don't get AIDS, they just die from it." And the slogan was really kind of repeated across the campaign and kind of represented here in a poster that, as you can see, was circulated as a bus shelter sign, right, across New York City. So a big question becomes, right, given the range of conditions that Change the Definition addressed, why did activists frame the campaign as a campaign that was really centrally about women and AIDS? And what did it mean that they did that, right? A really central reason the campaign was defined this way was that at its start, AIDS was stigmatized as a disease of gay men, of drug users, of Black and Latinx people, but not of women as they were normatively imagined, right? And if women with AIDS were acknowledged, it was as sources of risk to men and children, right, in terms that were bound up with racist and classist tropes, as promiscuous, as sex workers, as drug users, as welfare mothers, right? So Change the Definition fought to recognize women as neither innocent nor guilty of AIDS, but simply vulnerable to it. And it strategically sought medical recognition in order to challenge the social and cultural conditions of the epidemic. In so doing, it won a battle against state neglect in an era that was defined otherwise by the decimation of welfare benefits, the war on drugs, the criminalization of poor people and people of color. It marked a high point in anti-racist and intersectional feminist responses to AIDS. It advanced what Kathy Cohen's identified in ACT UP as the potential for a radical queer politics. It challenged racialized class and heteronormative constructions of gender, and it did so really especially by foregrounding the experiences and leadership of three overlapping groups: women living with HIV and AIDS, lesbians, and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. So in my time today, I'm going to first examine how campaign activists challenged prevailing meanings of women and lesbian in the campaign. Second, I'll address prison solidarity. And then third, I'll reflect on what it might mean to consider women, lesbian, and prison as relational categories of mobilization that we can read through a trans analytic, and how doing so might further a reconsideration of the relationships of women, lesbian, and trans in feminism. Okay. So women is an endlessly troubled category in general, but certainly in relationship to AIDS. 2 years into the epidemic, as it was recognized, the CDC designated 4 so-called risk groups to AIDS: homosexual and bisexual men, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and Haitian migrants. The list became colloquially referred to as the 4-H Club. Cis women and others assigned female formed part of 3 of these groups, but they were rarely recognized as such. Rather, if they were, it was as vectors of HIV transmission to men or fetuses, as I've noted, right? And this is really how AIDS stigma operates, right? To distinguish the normal or innocent from the deviant or guilty. So white, middle class, heterosexual, cis women were imagined as safe or deserving of safety from AIDS, while women of color, poor women, and those deemed sexually other or gender other were imagined as predictably at risk or even deserving of it. And I'm reminded here of Jules Gill-Peterson's comment that, quote, misogyny is not only pure or abstract woman hating. In practice, it fixes itself to women forced to live at the bottom of other social hierarchies like race and class that already overexpose them to violence, unquote. Importantly for activists, the CDC had expanded the AIDS definition twice before it changed the definition. This was important because it showed it was possible to change the definition. In 1987, that revision had increased recognition of AIDS among heterosexual injection drug users by 100%, meaning it doubled the cases recognized. It had increased figures among women by 60%, Latinx people by 50%, and African Americans by over 1/3. Despite that change, most women remained diagnosed very late in their disease course, if at all. Many died without even having been counted as having AIDS. So to activists and AIDS service workers, it became clear that the scope of the epidemic was larger than officially acknowledged, and that gaps in diagnosis, treatment access, and services caused a great deal of suffering. So activists chanted, murder by omission, change the definition, right? Popular sources at the time also really obscured risks of HIV infection in ways that tracked with normative gender. In 1985, the science magazine Discover claimed the so-called rugged vagina, that was their term, protected women, whereas the so-called vulnerable rectum put gay men at risk. I challenge us all to use these playfully. In 1988, the women's magazine Cosmopolitan claimed women were safe during what it termed ordinary sexual intercourse. And then it also stated that the rising cases of AIDS among women in Central Africa were caused by rough and brutal African men. At the same time, across North America, sensationalized narratives of sex workers with AIDS especially criminalized Black women and Black gay men, and fueled support for punitive quarantine to shield the so-called general public. Meanwhile, women with AIDS were figured as threats to unborn children and to state budget. So as Evelyn Hams put it, quote, white is what woman is, not white, and the stereotypes not white gathers in is what she had better not be, unquote. In all of this context, activists in Change the Definition argued that women stood at risk from 3 intertwined problems: the virus, the authorities that overlooked their disease, and the discourse that kept their AIDS invisible or unspeakable. Some researchers justified excluding women from AIDS drug studies by claiming that working class and poor women of color would not speak about and did not value gynecological health or their own sexual pleasure, nor could they even accurately recall their own sexual histories. But the Black feminist organization Sister Love, which participated in Change the Definition, created playful, joyful, safer sex curriculum by and for Black women. And the Women's Caucus of ACT UP conducted guerrilla outreach in pharmacies by plastering boxes of yeast infection medication with stickers that read, if you get a lot of yeast infections, you might be HIV positive, get tested, alongside the CDC hotline number. And this is a detail of one of those sticker sheets. They just took a set of address labels that you can run through a printer and then went to pharmacies and stuck it on boxes of Monistat or whatever the yeast infection medicine on the counter was. Change the Definition also really expanded narratives of lesbians' relationships to AIDS. And lesbians interviewed in ACT UP oral history projects describe ACT UP broadly and Change the Definition specifically as places to kind of expand their relationship to AIDS in three main ways, right? One, as spaces to exercise radical political leadership after battling homophobia and sexism in women's and left groups. Another, as venues to simply articulate a self-interest in fighting AIDS after years of being defined solely as caregivers to gay men, and also as sites of sexual freedom. And these three kinds of goals, radical political leadership, self-interest, sexual freedom, were brought together through the Change the Definition spokespeople who were themselves lesbians living with HIV and AIDS. Those spokespeople also had to counter against dominant representation that said that their existence in and of itself was a contradiction in terms. The CDC defined lesbians as women who had had sex exclusively with other women since 1977, which suppressed the number that it counted to a bare minimum. So this metric was really absurd for a lot of people coming of age in the late 80s or early 1990s. It also stood at odds with the lesbian and more broadly queer community understanding of self-identification. But the community understanding was hardly perfect either, right? It had long been fractured by race and class and riven by debates about butch femme, pornography, BDSM, and gender separatism. So the context of AIDS, both the fact of the virus and the rhetoric, right, the discourse of it, compelled many lesbians to start to shift what they meant, right, by that category, to be more candid about bisexuality and injection drug use, since these could be sources of HIV risk, and also to take a new look at kink, at porn, at sex toys, because they could be forms of safer sex. More broadly, it really compelled many to name what one source called the myth of sexual purity. I'm going to have to, let's see. You will not see the top of it. Yes, there you go. The myth of sexual purity, myth of lesbian purity, right, as a problem that blocked both medical recognition and community dialogue, right? So you can see this in this very detailed, right, flyer from the Change the Definition campaign, focused especially on lesbians with AIDS. But the kind of quote that I've pulled out, right, especially blames the CDC for reinforcing this myth of so-called lesbian sexual purity, right, and emphasizes the importance of naming, you know, not who you are, but what you do, right, as the source of HIV risk or prevention. As another example of this comes from activist and artist Zoe Leonard, who said, quote, "In order to get the information the scientists needed and we needed, we just had to stop worrying and arguing about identities and identification. We just had to talk about what are we doing, who is coming into contact with what," unquote. This comes from one of the ACT UP New York Oral History Project interviews. And Leonard, importantly, was one of a handful of lesbians in ACT UP New York who had a sexual relationship with Greg Bordowitz, who was a gay man living with HIV. Similarly, Keiko Lane in ACT UP Los Angeles had relationships with both other cis women and with gay men with HIV. She also really kind of represented that and has written about it, right? Represented it at the time by posing for a portrait with a close friend and lover, Corey Roberts Owley, and more recently in a memoir stating that, quote, "Dykes and fags sleeping together doesn't negate queerness, it amplifies it," unquote. So this was a kind of argument being put forth, right? But of course, it happened amidst disagreement, right? So kind of on the other side of this exchange, for example, a member of ACT UP San Francisco, Ingrid Nelson, recalls these really painful conflicts in that organization when some older lesbians in ACT UP San Francisco argued that women who slept with men shouldn't be allowed to wear t-shirts that said they were dykes, right? Nelson herself felt so mocked. In a meeting where this was being discussed, she raised the question of what was the statute of limitations on her sexual history. And she felt so mocked over that she just walked out of the meeting and said, you know, fuck it, I'm bisexual. Like, I will just completely abandon this identity category. You know, at the same time, others were kind of finding space within it, right, and pushing the boundaries. So you see this way that lesbian is both being expanded and contracted kind of simultaneously through these debates. Following transphobic logic, of course, debates over sex with men and over relationships to HIV also shaped views of trans people. And trans and non-binary and genderqueer people who have given oral histories of ACT UP describe varying responses to their identities that range from mentorship to acceptance to opposition. So, for example, Kathy Otterston, who's a trans woman in ACT UP New York, said that some in the organization excluded her from this meeting area that was informally designated for women, but also that other people disagreed with that there were kind of arguments over it, and that she brought other trans people to ACT UP meetings to practice being welcomed in their gender identity, right? Connie Norman, who was a trans woman who became a prominent leader in ACT UP Los Angeles. There's a film about her called AIDS Diva. Met a generally positive response. She was also selected to perform in the stage production AIDS Us Women, which was one of a series about the epidemic in different communities. And a handful of trans men and non-binary and genderqueer ACT UP veterans have also offered oral histories. They include Jamie Bauer, J.D. Davids, Samuel Lurie, and Crystal Mason, all of whom notably were also involved in Change the Definition and in prison solidarity through ACT UP. And all of them transitioned some years after ACT UP, but state that their time in the group helped them find models to subvert gender. But also that importantly for many, this came principally or at least first through sex and sexual culture. So J.D. Davids says that when they joined ACT UP Philadelphia, the lesbian sexual repertoire was expanding, right? Their quote was, people were like, yeah, fisting. And I didn't really need to be outside of Dyke because it was blowing up, right? So there was a lot for me there, unquote. The transcript of the oral history really says, makes explosion noise. And then, somewhat similarly, Crystal Mason, who was a genderqueer and prison solidarity activist in ACT UP San Francisco, who also became the subject of a portrait by Catherine Opie, became prominent for a time in the local Bay Area kink scene, including through play parties that challenged HIV stigma through blood exchange. And Mason is also someone I've interviewed who's continued to be active in prison work, continued to be active in the kink scene, and continued to be an artist. So, going a little further with this, the boundaries of dyke or lesbian identity were shaped not only by kind of discourse about sex and sexual practices, but specifically by debates over what was termed lesbian transmission, which is the question of whether people assigned female could transmit HIV to each other through sex. So again, kind of returning to Zoe Leonard, Leonard says, quote, nobody was writing about it, nobody was talking about it, and we didn't know if we were at risk or not. You could call up a doctor and be like, is there HIV in vaginal secretions? What are my risks for transmission? And no one would know, unquote. One CDC representative said publicly that lesbian transmission wasn't a serious concern because lesbians don't have much sex. And in response, changed the definition. Activists chanted, lesbians have sex. Lesbians get AIDS, as well as, CDC, you fucking scum, why don't you research women's cum? Among other chants on this sample chant sheet. The ACT UP video affinity group, Diva TV, also made safer sex pornography. And activists in Change the Definition had a contest to brainstorm sexier or at least more memorable names for the dental dam. Do I need to explain what a dental dam is? Is there anybody who doesn't know what a dental dam is? Okay. The options they came up with were condom, box top, love cover, comforter, vulva veil, pussy poncho, lady latex, oral fixture, hoover dam, vulva vavoom, and dame dam. My personal favorite is oral fixture. On the kind of more conflicted or serious side of these exchanges, right? Debates over lesbian transmission mobilized various claims to authority, and they could be really acrimonious. They were quite contested. Some contended that claims to lesbian transmission and lesbian safer sex reproduced mainstream AIDS hysteria. unthinkingly adopted gay men's sexual culture, or sought to claim the wound of AIDS. There were a handful of research studies conducted, including one by the CDC. Most found no evidence of lesbian transmission, but a few suggested it could occur. Activists who believed it to be impossible found their most important proof in just the low numbers overall of self-identified lesbians with HIV disease, and the fact that many who did exist held histories of injection drug use or sex with cis men or both. On the opposing side, those who held lesbian transmission to be possible argued that while it might not have happened at large scale yet, it could, because women could exchange blood during sex, and that HIV might be transmittable in vaginal fluid given a high viral load, a yeast infection, or heavier alcohol or drug use that suppressed the immune system. More generally, they argued that it was really crucial to define lesbian community capaciously in order to recognize the social determinants of HIV risk and to express anti-racism, class solidarity, and bisexual and trans inclusion. So as all of this suggests, arguments about lesbian transmission are most usefully analyzed not as fact or fiction, but rather as a discourse aimed at expanding sexual and gender community. So moving on to thinking about prisons. Attention to prisons offered changed the definition, a key geography through which to fight both the material and the cultural constructions of women and lesbian in relationship to AIDS. Because sexual and gender minorities are disproportionately policed, and because prisons are gendered institutions in which people have sex, attention to incarceration energized the question of lesbian transmission without requiring that it be resolved. More broadly, addressing women's HIV risk and safer sex challenged the interconnection of carceral power with sexual and gender norms. Many have noted, right, that the AIDS epidemic writ large has been really fed by prison growth, and was concurrent with prison growth, right, at sort of in the 80s, 90s. And that relationship exists in large part because mass incarceration strips away social and community resources and heightens privation and disease, right? Thereby increasing the chances of HIV exposure, illness, death, as well as more broadly, because the convergence of AIDS and incarceration reflects the heteronormative operation of racial capitalism, right? Which has articulated the ghettoization of Black and Latinx communities with LGBTQ life, right? For these same reasons, Che Gossett and Eva Hayward cite incarceration in naming race as central to trans women's experiences of AIDS. And Celeste Watkins Hayes shows that the sexualized drug economy and its criminalization structures Black and poor cis women's vulnerabilities to HIV. In another kind of reflection of this that was immediately apparent to the activists I'm looking at, in 1990, New York State reported that 20% of the people entering its state prisons were testing positive for HIV, right? So 20% of those entering women's prisons in New York State, 1 in 5. It was a rate significantly higher than entry into men's prisons, even though there were more numbers of incarcerated people with HIV disease who are assigned male. So we have this kind of context where that convergence of AIDS and incarceration is apparent kind of across gender, but also feminists are really taking note of its disproportional impact in women's prisons. From the early years of the epidemic, incarcerated people with AIDS met stigma, discrimination, and neglect, and they responded by organizing peer education inside. These projects developed in prisons around the country, but the one that became the most developed was called AIDS Counseling and Education, or ACE, and it was organized in the women's prison at Bedford Hills, New York. Incarcerated activists started to conceive of ACE in 1985. They won administrative approval and funding in 1988, and they kept the project active for well over a decade. Outside, a network of lesbian feminist prison solidarity activists drew attention to the project. This included that members of the ACT UP Women's Caucus regularly visited ACE leaders at Bedford Hills and reported back to other ACT UP activists about their visits. Members of ACE published essays and a book. They collaborated with supporters to create videos, including the 1992 documentary I'm You, You're Me, whose title screen is shown here. And in return, Change the Definition incorporated significant attention to prison issues in its defining document, which they called the Treatment and Research Agenda for Women with HIV Infection. And their campaign protests often highlighted prison issues, right, as evident in two placards from an ACT UP New York affinity group, the Lesbian Furies, right? ACE itself as a project focused its HIV education on heterosexual sex and injection drug use, but its peer educators spoke about queer sex and confronted prison censorship to do so. So for example, they staged role plays that discussed lesbian safer sex in the setting of a nunnery to poke fun at prison rules because they couldn't directly say, you know, to address your sex life inside, but they could say, imagine women in a nunnery, right? In I'm You, You're Me, the video about ACE, Linda Gang, who was a member of the project, described how others in ACE had helped her to disclose her HIV to her girlfriend. Martha Melendez, another ACE member, in a discussion of the importance of condom access in prisons, explained that women could not only use them with men, but also adapt them into dental dams or gloves to use with each other. And queer affection and kinship more broadly became apparent across the project. ACE's theme song was Sister by Chris Williamson, who was one of the most prominent lesbians in 1970s women's music. Various members of the group had relationships with each other, and ACT UP activist Monica Pearl recalls that members of ACE with AIDS flirted with her and that she was, quote, enchanted by that. Of course, within ACE, many incarcerated or formerly incarcerated women with HIV and AIDS were straight, but all were situated outside white middle-class heteronormativity, if only by their AIDS status. And AIDS work, AIDS organizing drew them into Queer Alliance. Katrina Haslip and Carmen Royster are two examples. They were both members of ACE who were straight identified and who became spokespeople and changed the definition. Both were living with HIV disease. After being released from prison, Royster joined ACT UP's New York's Latino Caucus. Haslip, for her part, after her release, worked for AIDS organizations in Brooklyn and was named as the proposed director for an AIDS program that Vocal, which is a queer of color organization, sought to run. She also joined many Change the Definition protests. She spoke to government bodies, including CDC bodies. In the image here, Haslip is at the left with the dreads. And her t-shirt and the placard carried by the person at the right both say dead but not disabled, which was a condition she herself experienced. By the fall of 1992, Haslip was ill with bacterial pneumonia and a CD4 count of 6. That's compared to a normal count of around 1,000. And as her friend and colleague Teresa McGovern recalls, according to then existing CDC criteria, quote, she didn't have AIDS, even though she was dying. She actually didn't qualify for Division of AIDS services and therefore couldn't get a home attendant. And she kept falling in her house. And I kept sending HIV positive women who were volunteers with the HIV Law Project to pick her up and take her to the hospital, end quote. So Haslip died on December 2nd, 1992, which was just a few weeks before the expanded AIDS definition she had helped to win was implemented. A number of lesbians with HIV disease also became major spokespeople of Change the Definition. One of the most prominent was Mary Lucy, who organized alongside her HIV negative partner, Nancy McNeil, in ACT UP Los Angeles. Lucy and McNeil had met in drug rehab not long after Lucy had been incarcerated in the California Institute for Women, which is a prison east of Los Angeles, commonly known as Frontera. At Frontera, women living with HIV and AIDS were segregated in a cramped, really pretty squalid ward where medical neglect was routine. The prison had confiscated Lucy's ACT. After release, Lucy remained really affected by inequities in care. She was unable to find a doctor in all of Los Angeles who could provide her with complete care as a woman with AIDS. So she sought up ACT UP Los Angeles to learn more about treatment options. And then with McNeil really helped to catalyze ACT UP Los Angeles's involvement in Change the Definition and in extensive prison solidarity campaigns. Lucy helped to lead protests at Frontera Prison and at the state capitol. And she testified to the CDC about the need for HIV research among women and lesbians. Additionally, she and McNeil kind of embodied to the community arguments for lesbian transmission because they spoke publicly as a couple about their commitment to safer sex to keep McNeil negative. Fast forward, begin to fast forward, and the Change the Definition campaign carried many different crisscrossing legacies. Its immediate offshoots in the early 1990s included in California a class action lawsuit over HIV care and other health care in women's prisons, and the formation of both the HIV in Prison Project and the Trans and Gender Variant Committee of California Prison Focus. In New York, an offshoot was the Lesbian AIDS Project led by Amber Hollabaugh, which foregrounded issues of incarceration, drug recovery, sex work, and trans and bi experience in lesbian HIV disease and prevention. Change the Definition also seeded a few women's AIDS organizations that operated nationally and internationally, most of which continued to address issues of incarceration. And then perhaps most importantly, I think by the end of the 1990s, several lesbian feminists and other queer AIDS prison activists played prominent roles in an event that really effectively launched the contemporary prison abolition movement, which was the Critical Resistance Conference held in Oakland, California in September of 1998. This convening really effectively introduced the vocabulary of prison abolition to a new generation of activists. Its lesbian feminist analysis was kind of signaled by Angela Davis's role as marquee speaker, as well as by the presence of a number of people leading workshops. Not long after Critical Resistance, Laura Whitehorn, who was a lesbian political prisoner who had organized AIDS peer education inside a federal prison, was released and became an editor of the HIV magazine Pause, right? Broadly kind of criticized in the AIDS movement as a little bit too glossy. This was the critique of Pause, that it took ads and it was glossy. But at the same time, interestingly, a magazine that really extended ongoing attention to issues of incarceration for years. Later, Whitehorn and other formerly incarcerated AIDS educators, Mujahid Farid and Kathy Boudin, co-founded the organization Release Aging People in Prison, which remains really active today, especially challenging New York state policy. As many of you may also be familiar with Black and Pink, which was an abolitionist group supporting LGBTQ and HIV positive prisoners, founded in 2005, followed in 2009 by the Zero Project, which advocates to end HIV criminalization laws. And then by the 2010s, there's a host of queer and trans prison abolition activism and scholarship emerging, right? And this brings me to today. So the coalitions mobilized through Change the Definition found new forms after the campaign ended because the campaign understood HIV and AIDS as an aspect of broader state violence, and because its activists both organized from and destabilized gender and sexuality. Materially, Change the Definition prolonged and saved lives by bringing tens of thousands more people into AIDS diagnosis and care. Culturally, it expanded the meanings of gender and sexuality by organizing them in relationship to both AIDS and incarceration, situating women, lesbian, and prison as contextual categories of mobilization rather than as fixed identities. And with thanks to my colleague, Olivia Polk, I use the term categories of mobilization to name the rhetorical and narrative frameworks that draw people together in social movements to imagine and strategize and act for change. So that is to describe not just what mix of people join a movement, but how people explain and remake their relationships to each other through activism. And the very name of the Change the Definition campaign really suggested its potential to remake not only AIDS diagnostic criteria, but even the terms through which people were seeing themselves and each other and who they could be. So while Change the Definition didn't centrally address transness, I argue that its categories of mobilization, women, lesbian, prison, can be generatively read through a trans analytic. And not to deny the existence of transphobia in the campaign or ACT UP, as I've tried to discuss, or to overread instances of trans inclusion or of individual transition as inevitable, right? But rather to linger over the relationality. I look here to Emily Owens, who warns against efforts to launder the lesbian relationship to trans by simply disavowing the figure of the TERF, right? Owens calls instead for scholars to consider what she terms the complexity of vitriol, exclusion, tension, disagreement, insufficient or failed solidarities as part of a dynamic feminist account of feminist gender history, unquote. So I read Owens as urging us not just to address trans exclusion in lesbian feminism, which is critically important, but also to examine how conflicts over exclusion both divide people and keep them in relationship to each other. Cameron Awkward-Rich similarly argues that trans and feminism might be linked through what he terms mutual desire that need not be defined as happy so much as, quote, something usable is produced by the attachment, unquote. So this is to say, activists fight with each other. It is one of the things activists do, but sometimes we stick together because of it. Arguments can generate new ideas, and language and categories of mobilization gain power by being unsettled and heterogeneous with blurry boundaries that draw people in. And we can see this in the ways that debates over lesbian transmission surfaced values that expanded the meanings of lesbian community politically and in people's sex lives and in relationship to gender, even if the medical question of transmission was never answered. Trans of Color critique especially has named movement across gender as both liberatory and as a disciplinary means of biopower, right? For example, through Riley Snorton's analysis of how conditions of slavery ungendered Blackness as flesh and thereby placed Blackness outside gender norms. Scholars have similarly applied a similar analysis to living with HIV and AIDS, right? To think about how living with the virus has been read as violating norms of womanhood and manhood in ways that have been racialized and ungendered as Black. There are just so many ways to fail at gender under its conditions of racial capitalism. As K. Marshall Green and Marquise Bay argue, Black feminism has named, quote, women as a category of failure because, again, quoting them, Black cisgender women in particular have always already functioned as an excess of that category, even while living as Black women. Countering this, they argue that Black feminism and trans feminism together pursue a remaking of liberation, of fugitivity from race and gender. So a trans analytic offers insights for how and why people who are variously positioned as women, as lesbians, as women living with HIV and AIDS, as lesbians living with HIV and AIDS, and as incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people came to share investments in the Change the Definition campaign and through it with each other. Activists in the campaign challenged the discourse that assumed women and lesbians were safe from HIV, that defined Black, Latinx, and poor women already living with HIV as deserving of stigma and death, and that accepted HIV and AIDS in prisons as proof of this ladder of value. They argued that defining lesbian feminist community through racialized and class boundaries of gender offered no community at all, and they proposed a new vehicle for community through prison solidarity. The history of Change the Definition helps to locate an abolitionist confrontation with prisons and with gender as both a problem and a locus of political subjectivity, something to struggle against as well as organize through. Thank you.